it became more common for people in the movement to say, well, it was a problem of poverty, of needing to be acculturated to modern city life as opposed to the peasant life from which many of them had come.
No longer seen as the sin of drunken immigrants, child abuse was now believed to be a crime created by poverty. For the next 40 years, social workers focused almost entirely on child neglect, on malnourished, ill-clothed, and unsupervised children. They virtually ignored physical and sexual abuse, and most often they blamed mothers for child neglect. One early social work pamphlet declared, "Much work comes to us because of ignorance of home virtues, and especially because of the lack of training of mothers." While child neglect was as much a painful reality then as it is today, according to Linda Gordon, placing the blame on women was a clear sign that child abuse was no longer a social priority.
It was a period of decline of the women's movement, and this is the most clear correlation that you can make throughout this period, that every time there is a women's movement, people are going to notice child abuse. And when the women's movement declines, there seems to be a burying of the issue. As an example, let me say that if you go and look at family casework, family social work textbooks in that period, you will find almost no mention of child abuse. I think it must have been very disturbing and frustrating and puzzling to be a social worker in the 1930s and to actually meet these scores of child abuse cases, but to feel that you're in this little isolated vacuum and no one outside is recognizing or talking about this issue.
Not only was there no mention of physical abuse, but victims of sexual molestation were labeled as delinquents or dirty girls. Sexual abuse of children was a crime that happened in the streets, not in the home. Many 20th century psychologists, including Freud, supported this prejudice by claiming incest taboos were so effective, sex between family members was rare.
In many ways, the long period between 1920 and the 60s could be described as a period in which nobody wanted to knock the family. I think that because of the two major national crises, first the Depression and then the Second World War, that both kinds of crises, war and economic crisis, tend to produce a pro-family reaction. We need to all hang together. We need to ignore these minor little problems within the family.
Something more persuasive than the social work movement was needed to re-expose child abuse to public scrutiny, to rattle the skeleton in the family closet. This was it, the X-ray. In 1960, pediatrician C. Henry Kemp and a group of radiologists revealed to the public that X-rays could show the difference between accidental and deliberate fractures in children. For the first time, there was medical proof of child abuse, proof that could not be ignored.
Suddenly there was an awareness on the part of people who had worked with children and families throughout the country that yes, this was it. This would explain why it was that so many children seemed to be recurringly brought into emergency rooms and clinics, who seemed to be chronically injured and who didn't seem to fit the pattern of children who typically fall off tricycles.
With their battery of X-rays, the doctors ended decades of silence, but it took an even greater force to keep child abuse in the public conscience.
I think that the reason that child abuse was rediscovered in the 1960s is primarily related to the social movements of that period. There's quite an extraordinary parallel between the social movements of the 1960s and the social movements that stretched from the 1840s into the 1870s. In that earlier period, the anti-slavery movement was the major social movement. And in the 1960s, the civil rights movement was the first, the kind of mother movement that gave birth to the others. In the 1840s, again, the anti-slavery movement gave rise to a powerful women's rights movement. It also did so in the 1960s. The difference is that in the 1960s and 70s, what intervened was also this very powerful anti-Vietnam War movement. And the anti-Vietnam War movement was very relevant to the whole issue of family violence because it was a peace movement.
Almost overnight, there was an explosion of social consciousness and a heightened awareness of the levels of damage inflicted on children. The reformers who saved Mary Ellen would have been astonished to find we now consider emotional abuse as potentially violent as the crack of a whip.
Children believe what their parents tell them.
You're pathetic. You can't do anything right.
You disgust me. Just shut up.
You can't be my kid.
You're worthless.
Why don't you go find some other place to live?
Words hit as hard as a fist. Stop and listen to what you're saying. You might not believe your ears.
I wish you were never born.
Take time out.
Child abuse robs children of their dignity. It robs them of their sense of self-esteem. It robs them of control. That sense of always being helpless, of never knowing what's going to happen to you and having no way out is the most damaging of anything that can happen to a person. You can hit a kid, and then the kid can get angry and run away and go tell grandma, and grandma will come over and say, hey, what'd you do to my grandson? That kid has some power. But you take a child and isolate him or her and convince him he's stupid, worthless, or that at any given point in time, you'll never know when, I'm going to come into your bedroom and I'm going to molest you, or I'm going to lash out at you for no apparent reason, or you can never do anything right. You have robbed that child of his or her ability in life to ever feel good about himself or herself.
The notion seems simple. Abuse a child and you set the stage for a lifetime of emotional turmoil. But that's not all. Abused children do not live in isolation forever. Just as this healthy child will affect many lives during her lifetime, so do abused children. Informal studies of prison inmates nationwide reveal up to 98% of those convicted of violent crimes were abused as children. While not all abused children grow up to be criminals, many do end up abusing their own children. This fact is dramatically shown in a videotape from a research center for child abuse and neglect. At first, it looks innocent. A father playing with his young son, tossing toys at the boy's face. Moments later, the child mimics this play behavior by aggressively throwing toys at the doll's face. Colorado psychologist Dr. Claire Haynes Seaman has worked with many abused children and their families. She has seen the tragic results of abused children growing up to be abusive parents.
When you think of one person who was inadequately parented, abused in some way, and who has not developed a good sense of self, does not have the ability to parent, they may have 5 children. And then you have not 1, but 5 children who are abused and neglected and inadequately parented, and they each have children. So just by that, we're going in quantum leaps in terms of what's happening in our society, unless we begin to change it.
The changes have come slowly. As if frightened to peel away the layers of a national hurt, it took 10 years after the first revelations of physical abuse in the 1960s before incest and sexual abuse of children were discussed openly. Incest was and still is the ultimate violation of family harmony. This time, television broke the silence. A 1972 episode of the dramatic series Marcus Welby, M.D., broke new ground with a story of a young boy who was sexually abused by his coach.
You have got to understand that there's a lot at stake here. For you, for me. Blakely, I thought you were ready to